Hey everybody, our game of the week on the Irrelevant Lasers podcast was titled Excitebike this week. While we talked about it, we didn't really get into the technical details of the game, and that's why we're going to do this on video. As I started researching it, there was a ton of stuff I didn't know, and I really started nerding out over it. Excitebike is everybody's favorite motocross game. It came out on the Famicom and the NES. It was developed by Nintendo Research and Development 1, which at the time was the oldest development team at Nintendo. The director for Excitebike was none other than the creator of Mario, Zelda, Donkey Kong, so many more, Shigeru Miyamoto. There are actually two versions of Excitebike. Let's talk about the one most of us probably know and love first. So Excitebike originally came out at the end of November in 1984 for the Famicom in Japan. Then about 11 months later in mid-October 1985, United States got it on the NES. That was followed up in February of 86 in Canada, and then it finally came to Europe September of the same year. As a side note, it was also later published by Hudson Soft on the NEC PC-8801 and the Sharp X1. These were 8-bit computers sold in Japan. There were some marketed variations in the US of these computers, but the version of Excitebike for the PC-8801 and the Sharp X1 had one small difference. It had a space in the title, like Excite Bike. Anyway, we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on the Famicom and NES versions. The controls were pretty easy. The B button is the turbo button. The engine accelerates quickly, and the speed is fast, but if used too much, the engine will overheat. When the engine overheats, the bike can't be operated until it cools down. The A button was the accelerator and the brake button. Press it and the bike accelerates, let it go and the brake operates. Really, this was the slower of the speeds. When jumping, you mainly had two directions to press. Back is to the left and forward is to the right. Back makes you jump higher and forward makes you jump lower, but the bike moves a lot faster when you jump forward. When jumping, if you lean forward too far, you'd crash your bike, while if you're riding and you pulled backwards, you can pop a wheelie, but if you go back too far, you'll crash as well. There are some other things about the controls we could talk about, but it gets pretty boring, so we're going to move on. Most of the game was straight up the same on all versions. There were 3 modes, and they were Selection A, Selection B, and Design. Selection A and B let you do time trials, or they called it Challenge Race, on 5 different tracks. In Selection A, no other riders were involved. In Selection B, they put you up against other riders on the same 5 tracks that you saw through Selection A. There were 2 races on each track. If you qualify, the second time you race the track, there'd be more obstacles on the course. So to get to track 2, you'd have to qualify twice on track 1, if that makes sense. But you could choose what track you wanted to start out on. Let's stop and talk about qualifying for a second. To qualify, you had to place first, second, or third. The third qualifying time actually shows on the bottom left-hand side of your screen as you're racing, and the first place time is shown on the stands in the background, and you can see it go by once in a while as you race. If you fail to beat the third place time, your game's over. The game did also keep your best time until you turned off your console. So let's get back to Selection B. The other riders you faced against, they didn't really race against you. If you left them in your dust, they'd reappear ahead of you. So suffice to say, you were just racing the clock with new moving obstacles. The other riders could knock you off your bike, but you could knock them off their bike as well. To knock the other riders off, you had to be in front of them enough as you changed into their lane, or be directly in front of them as they ran into your back tire. Remember, they can do the same to you as well, only the computer bikers don't really have aggressive attitudes. I felt like they were just kind of racing their own race and not really paying any attention to what was going around them. Of course, this was like 1984, 1985 AI. It certainly isn't what it is today. The third mode was Design Mode. This is where things got a little different on the Famicom and the NES versions. Both allowed you to design your own tracks. There was a finite amount of things that you could put on the track before it forced the finish bump. They both had options to design, save, load, and reset, only the US, Canada, and European versions didn't actually have these features included, so while it said it on the screen, only the Famicom in Japan had the option that allowed saves of the player-created tracks on a cassette tape, but it required the Famicom data recorder peripheral. Since the peripheral was only available in Japan and intended for use with the Nintendo Family Basic, the English versions never had the ability to save, even though the options were there. The game's English manual on the bottom of page 10 says save and load menus are not operable in this game. They've been programmed in for potential product developments. So pretty much tough luck, suckers. They later took those options off in the e-reader version for the Game Boy Advance. Then they were added back in for the Wii Virtual Console, the NES Classic Edition, and also the Switch. Now, at the beginning of the video, I mentioned there were two versions of Excitebike. The other version's called Versus Excitebike. This version of the game was built for the Nintendo Versus system, which is hardware built for arcade cabinets based on the NES. The hardware shared chips and processors directly with the NES, and all the games made for the Nintendo Versus systems were ports of NES games, modified greatly. The system had a heavy focus on two-player games, although Versus Excitebike was not two players in the arcade. Versus Excitebike played the same way as Excitebike, except for a few differences. There were 7 tracks to play, there were 3 different difficulty settings, beginner, intermediate, and advanced. The tracks worked the same way, meaning that you had to run each track twice and qualify to move forward to the next track, only on the second run the track didn't change, it added other riders. There was only 1 lap on your solo run, but 2 when you faced off against other riders. The game also had a score which was associated with how fast you went, and also points for qualifying in a certain position. So that changed the screen a little bit as well. While you were racing, you saw the top score in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, and in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, you saw your score. Qualifying was slightly different too. You had to beat the top 5 riders' time, which I believe is what Real Motocross does, instead of just like the top 3 on the NES version. When you qualified, you also earned ranking points depending on your place. The game kept the top 5 times for each of the 7 tracks, plus the top 10 for score. Versus Excitebike was also released on the Famicom Disk System in Japan. The Famicom Disk System was a Famicom peripheral that could use proprietary floppy disks. This version had several things that were specific to it. The game features a versus mode named Versus Excite, in which 2 players compete against each other. The options included the maximum number of rounds to play, the track, and the number of laps for said track. The music is completely different. None of the songs from the original game are present in this version, and a theme is played during the gameplay. There's also an original Excite mode, and it's based off the main mode of the arcade version, with minor differences such as the color palette. The arcade game used a different color palette versus the RGB the Nintendo and the Famicom used. Its rewritable disc format also allowed the player to save created tracks. The Famicom Disk System version of Versus Excitebike is also available on the Switch. Hey, who knew there was so much to know about Excitebike? And we didn't even focus on the Play Choice 10 or all the later versions of the game that came out on other systems. Thank you so much for watching. Look out for more companion videos for the Irrelevant Lasers podcast. We'll leave you a link to the podcast and some sources in the description below. Thanks again.